Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary with a knife video. Today I have the Medford Knife and Tool 187. This is a really cool blade, and one that I was pretty excited to get. I was actually offered this in a trade, and I accepted the trade. I'll be honest, I wasn't really anticipating that I would like this knife as much as I would, but I knew the value was there, and so I figured worst case scenario, I can sell it. Okay. Turns out when I got it, I've been very impressed. So I'll talk about that as we go along. But just by way of introduction, Medford Knife and Tool, you probably have heard of the Medford Praetorian. They're a very expensive sort of mid-tech knife. These are from, of course, the same people. They're meant to be a little more budget friendly than the Praetorian. Now, they're still not budget friendly, okay? You're still looking at like $425, I think, retail, and you can pick these up on the secondary market for about $350. So you're only, you're saving us 75 bucks there, but it's still an expensive knife. I didn't pay that, of course. I got it in trade, and it was a very good trade that I was quite happy with. But I am extremely excited to have this knife. Number one, because the DPT, to my knowledge, is discontinued. So they're not making any more drop point tantos. Also because of the colored scale. The colored scales are just sort of, luck of the draw, okay? And what I mean by that is they're not specifically saying, hey, you can't call Medford Knife and Tool and say, hey, I want 100 green ones. They just make what they make, and you get what you get. So the fact that I was able to get an OD green one, or that's what I was offered, I was pretty excited about. And that's one of the reasons I accepted this as trade, because it was the colored scale rather than the black. So the other thing I have to say about this is when I got it, as I said, I was thinking I may just sell it because I haven't had great luck with what I would call, folding pry bar type knives, with the exception of ZT. They tend to put a good edge on. But this knife I have been extremely impressed with, because even though it's thick and bulky and heavy and big, it will actually cut. Okay, a lot of knives that are kind of in this vein do not cut well. And I hate to say this, but part of that is because they're often made for guys who are more collectors rather than users, and frankly, collectors don't care if their knives cut. They don't even need to be sharp, okay? Now, if you're like me, and although I do collect and I like to have some cool knives, I use them, okay? And so if you're a user, you care how well this thing cuts, all right? So that's my sort of introduction to this. That's the knife it is. That's I was happily surprised by this knife, let's put it that way. Once I got it and I started carrying it and messing with it, it did have a little bit of lock stick, by the way, the first few days. That is pretty much gone. It's still a little sticky, but that'll work in, okay? And I've opened this and closed it quite a number of times already, and it just gets easier as time goes by. Now, let's tell you a little bit more about just what has been so impressive about this knife, starting with size and weight. Number one, it's a big knife, and I like big knives, okay? So, that obviously appeals to me. This knife is 9 3/8 inches overall. The blade length is 4 1/8. The cutting edge is 3 7/8, and the handle is 5 1/4. So it's a fairly big knife. It's also 5/8 of an inch thick and 7 ounces. So you've got a big, heavy knife, although I will say, when you consider the thickness of these components, 7 ounces is totally reasonable. You have a huge piece of D2 steel here. You have a very huge piece of titanium, a huge piece of G10. Obviously, the blade is adding the most out of all those components. But overall, you can just, when you look at the size of this knife and you look at the thickness of the components, you go, yeah, 7 ounces is completely understandable. So although that's heavy, it's not too heavy for the size of this knife, number one. And number two, it's completely understandable if you just look at this knife and kind of give it a once over. You go, yeah, this thing, you would expect it to be heavy. All right. Now, having gotten those specs out of the way, that's one of the things I really like. The size to weight is actually not that bad. The handle being as big as it is gives you tons of real estate, and I really like that. The blade, of course, is a nice big thick hunk of D2, which who wouldn't like that? I've got to tell you guys, this is a bit of an aside, but D2 I need to make a whole video just about D2 because it's probably my favorite steel. It just takes an edge like crazy. It's insanely tough. Very, very durable, rust resistant enough. They call it semi-stainless. I've never had a problem with any of my D2 blades rusting, you know, although I don't live right by the ocean or anything, but I've had great luck with D2 steel. Anyway, back to the main thing that we're talking about here. Size and weight on this knife is quite good, especially if you like large knives, okay? You will not be disappointed. This is as large as anyone could probably want for a, you know, pocket carry EDC style knife. Now, I will do some comparisons right here and now. So there is the 187 DPT. One thing I wanted to bring out is my Microtech DOC, not because I think it's terribly comparable to the DOC. Number one, this is a fairly well-known knife. It's known to be a large knife, but because this knife kind of begs comparison to the Strider. Now, this knife, you can see, is larger than an SMF. It has more cutting edge than an SMF. It's thicker and more heavily built than an SMF. And yet, if you remember my SMF video, my issue with those is that they don't cut well. And so this does cut well. The edge geometry is actually really, really good. Okay, so there it is compared to a DOC. And most people would say a DOC is a very large knife, and they'd be right. So the fact that this is even bigger is revealing just about what I mean when I say this is a big knife. What else have we got here? Here is zero tolerance 0560. Again, awesome blade. Again, a big knife. Okay, so the fact that again this is bigger says something. It is also heavier, and that makes sense considering the components are much thicker. And I would say, you know, this is a knife with thick, heavy built components, and you can see that every aspect of the DPT is quite a bit thicker and larger. Now, of course, when we talk about hard use or tactical style knives, you gotta consider the Recon 1. And the Recon 1 is basically the same size, okay? So take a look at those two side by side. Obviously, the components on the 187 are heavier and more robust, as well as more expensive, okay? Not only that, but this is gonna be hand built compared to factory built in Taiwan. Now, the one thing that these don't compare very well in is steel. This is the AUS 8 steel, this is D2, but now if you buy a Recon 1, it'll be in CTS XHP, which is phenomenal, okay? One last comparison, and this one will come back in a couple minutes. There's a couple points I wanna make. This is the Ferrum Forge Ferrex. Obviously, it's a lot smaller. This is a more pocketable knife, but both of these are very heavily built. Both of these are big, thick slabs of steel. Obviously, this is the M4 rather than D2, but two of probably my favorite like heavy built knives. And I've had quite a number of knives that are, you know, supposed to be robust, sort of combat, hard use knives. And these two are the ones that I really think stand out as my favorites. Now, let's move on to the rest of the stuff we want to say about this now that we've got some comparisons out of the way. And I will say, if you're looking for sort of a hard use combat style knife, this is a great option. And I would take this and, you know, I don't mean to start a big fight or anything like that, but for my mileage, I would take this over a Strider any day of the week. And they're around the same price point, and they're similar in construction, okay? So that's my size and weight and comparisons. Let's get into this blade, okay? Blade is 3/16 of an inch, D2 steel, 4 1/8 inches overall, 3 3/8 inches of cutting edge. What I really love about this is the vulcanized finish. It looks just amazing. And one of the things that vulcanized finish does, let me zoom in here so you can really see how that looks, and also so I can explain a couple things. Come on. Sorry about that, guys. The remote is not cooperating. I guess communicating with the camera is what's really happening. So there we go. There is that drop point tanto. You can see the mirrored or semi-mirrored edge on the blade, and you can see that vulcanized finish, how it puts sort of these wavy patterns into the knife. just looks really awesome with sort of oranges and browns and reds. Really, really cool looking blade. And the cool thing about this, the way the vulcanizing is done, it just sort of happens, okay? So no two of these blades are going to be the same. So your knife is literally going to be different than everyone else's, which is really, really cool. The grind on this, of course, is a hollow grind on the flat and a flat grind here. Pretty traditional for a Tanto style grind, right? That's what you expect to see. One cool thing is there's just the slightest curve here on that secondary grind. And I can tell you this knife cuts really, really well because of that hollow grind. And I probably sound like a broken record here, but again and again, I've said this. If you want to make a hard use, really robust folding knife, do it with a hollow grind, because then you can get all the thickness and all the durability you could ever want out of this big, thick, heavy piece of steel, but you still end up with a knife that will cut things, which, by the way, seems to be what you're looking for, or at least what I'm looking for in a knife. Okay, so you end up with a blade that is a nearly perfect combination of strength, durability, toughness, especially in that D2 steel, and which will also cut extremely well because of the hollow grind. Okay, so excellent, excellent blade on this. Super, super impressed with that. Now, let's move on to the handle. Okay, and I'm going to stay zoomed in here just because I think this is such a cool knife. Normally I would zoom back out to talk about lockup and deployment, but I'm just going to talk about it. So this, the washers on here are bronze washers, no ball bearing pivot system in this, which is kind of refreshing as far as I'm concerned. It does have a proprietary pivot, which kind of sucks, okay? Because if you do want to either take this knife down or you want to adjust the tension on that pivot, you really can't do it without a special tool either from Medford, or you'll have to make it yourself. Now, it wouldn't be the hardest thing in the world to make a tool to fit this, but it's kind of a pain in the neck. I mean, why not just put a standard sort of accepted fastener on here, okay? And I know it makes the knife unique, and I know it's kind of a cool factor type of thing, second type of cool, but from a practical standpoint, I'm not that big on it, okay? Now, I will say it is a titanium frame lock, and so you've got this nice thick lock bar here. Very, very good lockup. I will say it did have a bit of lock stick when I first got it, but as I said, it's been breaking in well over time. You can see the lockup is pretty early there still. Now, when I talk about the strength of this lock, it is strong in the sense of it's a very good, secure interface between the blade and the lock bar. However, here's the one issue that I'm going to take with this lock bar. We're holding a knife that's designed to be hard use and tactical and, you know, ready for anything and just tough as can be. But when you look at the relief cut here, okay, it is extremely thin. If you compare to, I don't have the knife I really wanted to show you. This one's going to have to do. If you compare it to the zero tolerance, you can see the zero tolerance is thicker in the material that's right here. Okay, but what I really want to compare this to is the Ferox. So see how thick that relief cut is. It's super thick and robust, and you know, if you put a lot of pressure on this, it's still going to be the weakest point in the lock bar, but it's going to be far less likely to fail than this will. Okay, so you've built this super huge, crazy tough knife, and then you've made one of the thinnest relief cuts I've seen. I mean, my military in TI is thicker than this. Pretty much every titanium frame lock that I own has a thicker piece of titanium here than this. And if you watched the cold steel testing videos where they you know, hang a whole bunch of weight off of this, sure enough, these frame locks do fail right at the relief cut, which makes perfect sense. That's going to be the weakest point, of course. But to my mind then, what you ought to do is take some kind of steps to make this thicker. And I think the guys at Ferrum Forge have done the best job of any knife that I've seen on this. And what they've actually done is milled out basically a hole in there. So they've created like an I-beam structure in the lock bar, and that's going to be very, very strong. Okay, so I would have liked to see something like that on this. So that's lockup and deployment. Totally acceptable, very, very good, other than that very thin relief cut, which I would like to have seen done a little better. Now, let me back out here. Come on, come on. There we go. And we'll talk about the rest of this knife. So we've talked about lockup and deployment. Let's move on to the handle. The handle is really, really cool. I love the finishes. I love that you can see some of the cutouts in here. I especially love the milled clip. And I'm just going to say this about this clip. I've carried this quite a bit in some pretty thick pants. And what almost always happens with milled clips, in my experience, is that after a while, the titanium gets a bit of a bend to it so that the clip is not contacting the frame of the knife anymore. And if you tap on this, you'll get a little tick, 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 tick. I've had this for a fair while now and carried it a lot, and that has not happened. The clip is still exactly the way it was when it came to me, which I think is great. So you got a milled clip that doesn't have the weak point of a lot of milled clips. All right, the finish on the titanium is a very nice stone washed finish that's going to hold up really, really well to wear and tear. And of course, G10, you're not going to hurt G10. There is some good texturing on here, which does make the knife very grippy. It is quite comfortable in hand, although the corners could stand to be chamfered just a little. And I would like to see a bit more of a cutout here, a bit of a front choil that allows my front finger just to sink into this handle a little bit further than it does. Now, it's not the end of the world, okay, but I would like to have seen that there. The other thing I'd like to see is the jimping is all the way up here. And so it works well if you choked up on the knife. By the way, talking about ergonomics, there is a very nice finger choil, very functional, that allows you to choke up and do some more detailed work and get a lot more control, okay? But if you're back here where you're going to be holding the knife a lot of the time, it would be nice to have just some jimping that extended around this area, especially considering this is not a flipper, so you're not going to run into the complaint that you run with flippers, which I think is for babies anyway, where people complain that, oh, when I flip my knife, it wears out my finger. You're not going to get that with this anyway because it's not a flipper, so why not go ahead and put a row of jimping just there on the back, or even a row of jimping here on the front. I think both of those would have been appreciated. I will say this, obviously someone at Medford knows how to do jimping because the jimping that is on here, right here, is extremely good. It's perfect, all right? And so it's just grippy enough that it really retains your hand, and if you had put this jimping here and here, that would have been awesome. Down here, it's not really doing a whole lot for anybody, okay? So, the handle is comfortable, totally functional, and really, really cool looking, okay? So I do like the handle, even though I have had a couple of complaints that I shared with you. It is very comfortable. Although I've complained a little about jimping, I'm not really concerned. The G10 is more than grippy enough that you're gonna get good retention in hand on this knife, okay? Now, overall, what do I think of this knife? If you don't know already, I'm very impressed. Couple of small things that I would have liked to see done differently, but otherwise, fantastic knife. I would highly recommend this. If you're in that, if you're in the market for a very tough, durable, high-end folder, I think this is a great option for you. If you really like Medford Knife and Tool, but you think $600, $800 or more is too much to spend to go to a Praetorian, I think this is a great option. In fact, because of the design, I find this to be a much more practical design than a Praetorian anyway. For someone who's going to use the knife, I think this is actually a better option. So, that's my take on the Medford Knife and Tool 187 drop point Tanto, and really a lot of my comments are going to apply to all of the 187s. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I know I never quite get as many views on these more higher end knives just because, it's like watches, right? More people are buying Casios than Rolexes, so you're going to have more interesting Casios. And I know more people are buying the $100 Spydercos than they are the $400 Medfords. That's okay, totally get it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'd love to hear your comments. What's your favorite hard use folder? What have you found that you really like? And what are some things that you find on hard use knives that maybe you wish would be changed as well? Talk to you soon.